The US has vowed it will not test capability of destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite missiles in space. But China, Russia and India already have and look set to continue. The implications of this go well beyond the potentially devastating effect of the excesses of debris being added to low orbit. This is also about the weaponising of space. Dr. Cassandra Steer is Deputy Director at the Australian National University's Institute for Space, and she joins me now. Cassandra, welcome. Given the high-stakes game we're talking about here, why have proposed treaties around security and weapons in space never gained traction, with the US in particular?
It's a very good question. So we've actually had decades of a deadlock around space arms control. There hasn't been a huge appetite for countries to sign on to new kinds of international law treaties in any area, let alone in space. But I think in space in particular, the tricky thing has been really identifying what is it we're trying to control. It's very hard to define what a weapon is in space. China and Russia have multiple times over the years presented a draft treaty for the prevention of the placement of weapons in space, but that focuses only on space-based weapons. And it's very hard to verify and define even what a weapon is. And the US has pushed back against that consistently, as has its allies. But the biggest threats really to space systems are not even space-based weapons. They're very much ground-based interruptions, interferences. And as you mentioned, China, India, Russia, and indeed the US have all tested direct-ascent missile-type weapons to destroy a satellite in space.
Well, they can't all agree on it, but what do you think a weapon is in space?
I have no definition. This is the biggest problem, is that there are a lot of very positive, benign technologies in space as well. You mentioned that one of our biggest problems is space debris. There's an enormous amount of space traffic. You and I depend on satellites right now for this interview and for people watching it. We depend on satellites for our banking, our telecommunications, our navigation, our weather, our climate tracking, search and rescue, bushfires, you name it. There's probably a satellite system involved in that. But what we need to do to deal with the space debris is to try and figure out how to extract or remove some of the debris that's in these heavily used orbits around the Earth, or to service satellites while they're in orbit to extend their lives, and that then means that they don't become bits of space debris. But if you have the technology to service a satellite or to capture a dead satellite or a piece of debris, you also have the technology that could be repurposed as a kind of weapon. So it's nearly impossible to define what we mean by a space weapon.
Well, you mentioned Russia earlier. Its missile test that destroyed one of its own satellites in late 2021 was internationally condemned as an incredibly irresponsible act, adding more than 1,500 trackable pieces of debris into low orbit. What have been the repercussions there?
So debris is indeed, as I just said, one of the biggest problems. So there's about 4,500 active satellites that we all use. It's very hard even to track the exact number of satellites because there are launches going up every month or so. And then there is about an estimated 128 million pieces of debris that go down to a millimeter. And something the size of a pea can be lethal to one of these satellites that we depend on. So the debris created by the Russian satellite anti-satellite weapons test was indeed extremely worrisome. It was a very irresponsible test, given that we know from the previous Chinese, US and Indian tests, we know that debris is created. We know that the movement of that debris is entirely unpredictable. Some of it can stay in orbit for years or decades. Some of it gets kicked up into higher orbits than where the actual collision or destruction of the satellite took place. It's impossible to contain the movement of that debris. So the implications are extremely serious.
Well, Cassandra, knowing that, would you maybe paint a picture for us of what the implications could be if nations across the globe had the capacity to target and destroy satellites?
Indeed. I mean, I think actually these kinds of direct-ascent weapons are not the greatest threat because of the debris that's created and because it's impossible to contain those effects even on one's own satellites or the satellites and space systems of one's allies and partners. And so although we've seen these tests by these 4 countries, in fact, they are not the greatest threats. The greatest threats are non-kinetic, often reversible or temporary interferences, because they're much harder to trace where they come from, who who the author was of such an interruption or attack. They might be cyber attacks. They might be jamming a signal, the way that you jam a radio signal, or spoofing a signal, so sending a false navigational signal, which could be very detrimental, particularly during military operations, but even for civil operations like shipping and aviation. So those kind of non-kinetic interruptions are the biggest threat, which is again why it's so hard to define what we mean by a weapon. And it's also one of the reasons why the US's decision to explicitly state that it will never again test these direct-ascent debris-creating weapons. It's an excellent move forward. It's a pretty easy commitment to make because it's not an effective weapon. It is indeterminate. It's non-discriminate in the sense that you can't, as I said, contain the effects of it. And that actually also comes into breach with the laws of armed conflict. If you can't discriminate between what objects are going to be impacted or who's going to be impacted, that could in fact be an unlawful attack. So it was a fairly simple but very positive commitment that the US made, and Canada has also joined the US in that. I hope to see more countries making that commitment because although it's quite limited, it is still a positive move forward in terms of space arms control.
Yeah, interesting to hear what you say there about the US and Canada, but would you say we're in the early formative years of what is effectively an arms race in space, given that Russia and India in particular have openly declared they're testing anti-satellite technologies?
Yes, indeed. And so they were the first to explicitly state that that's what they were doing. When China and the US did it in the past, in 2007 and 2008, they justified their actions by saying they were either testing out a technology for removing debris and accidentally created an awful lot more debris, or for safety reasons. But everyone globally read those as anti-satellite weapons tests. The fact that India in 2019 and then Russia in 2021 openly declared this to be an ASAT test, an anti-satellite weapons test, was what I think led to that international condemnation. And the focus really has been now moved away from trying to define a weapon towards responsible behaviors. So I think you're right. I think we do have a bit of an arms race in space. The UN has spent many years focusing on an agenda to prevent an arms race in outer space that has been fairly limited in terms of coming up with any concrete outcomes or commitments or binding statements. So what we're seeing now is a move towards language around responsible behaviors, and that is a proxy for arms control. That's actually a very positive move that we're now seeing from the UN General Assembly. In 2021, in November, a resolution was adopted that's around reducing space threats by articulating rules, norms, and principles on responsible behaviors. So countries have started tabling reports. The language condemning the Russian and the US tests, the Indian tests, were both very much focused on the irresponsibility of this activity. And so we're starting to see, because we can't define capabilities or space weapons, we're seeing a move very positive, and I'm quite optimistic about where that takes us, to come up with internationally agreed norms about responsible behavior in space.
What about the creation of the US Space Force back in 2019? Did it act as something of a catalyst, would you say, for other nations to move forward with their own national space programs? Was it seen as a military power play for US dominance of space?
Yeah, indeed. In fact, it could be seen as a slightly disruptive moment. So China, most of its space programs, whether they are for civilian or military purposes, they tend to come from a central agency. So they already had something that looked a little bit like a space force, though not quite the same. But when the US announced that it would create a separate armed force alongside its Army, Air Force, and Navy, I think that was a bit of a disruptive moment geopolitically, and China and Russia in particular saw that as a threat to their space systems and have since ramped up their own military space spending and some of the rhetoric around their space strategies. There is some sense to having a space force in that space is such a critical domain these days, both civilian and military purposes. But calling it a space force was potentially an escalatory step. And what we've seen since is a lot of countries around the world have developed their own space command. Australia has one just since a couple of months ago, this year in 2022. But we also have amongst our partners and allies Japan, the UK, New Zealand, Germany, France. They all have their own space commands. And so those are units or divisions within an armed force. They're joint. They have Army, Air Force and Navy personnel. And that's because space serves all of those domains. And that is probably a less escalatory or problematic way to go about really centralizing necessarily how we approach space for defense purposes without it being, read as a bit of a provocative move, which the US had made.
Well, here we are sitting in the Asia-Pacific wondering how it affects us. So how do Asia-Pacific nations fit into this unfolding picture? How do they proactively and potentially collaboratively move towards helping secure space?
An excellent question, and I think more work needs to be done regionally. So space is now very much on the agenda of the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue that is between Australia, India, US, and Japan, which is an important regional dialogue around various security issues, and space is now put on the agenda. What we need to do, I think, what Australia really could be doing, and all of our partners in the Asia-Pacific region, is collaborating both on the civilian and on the defense or military sides, because the two are very much intertwined in space. Almost all of our space systems have dual purposes. The government and the military may well be a client, as well as could a commercial entity or you or I be a client for a service from a satellite. So we need to have much more collaboration. We have a new agreement or kind of a ramped up agreement between India and Australia. I think that we could be doing those countries in the Asia Pacific which have strong space programs like Japan, South Korea, and Australia and New Zealand. We could be doing a lot more capacity building for our Pacific partners. That is in their interests and in our own, particularly with what we see going on in the region. And that capacity building, if it's focused on the civilian side and civilian technologies, will still serve a regional security purpose.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cassandra Steer, Deputy Director at the Australian National University's Institute for Space.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jason.